Hello and welcome to Cheshire Audio. And this is going to be the cosy chat on amplifiers I've been promising. I actually promised cartridges, but I've switched. Partly because it's quite a big subject. There's quite a lot to talk about with amplifiers, and particularly through the 80s, there was some. You don't get so many companies like this now, but there was an awful lot of very small companies of sort of particularly dedicated people who were just very, very into the subject and were making wonderful products. Sometimes just a sole trader, sometimes a couple of staff. Yeah, it was quite interesting times, really. And I think people were more focused on sound quality then. You could get away with slightly shoddy build or slightly iffy reliability and all that sort of thing. And I think today we've actually we've got round all that. Things are better. It seemed to be physically better made, but most of them sound a bit bland, really. There's an awful lot of bland equipment, really. I mean, obviously there's exceptions. We've got the Rigas and the Atolls and the Exposures, and there's companies out there that are still doing it. But a lot of the mass market stuff has gone very bland, and it's probably because the wrong people are in charge. I think you don't have that enthusiast at the helm who really wants to make the best products possible. The Julian Vericas and all these sort of people. So yeah, so I just wanted to go through a few favourite things that just stood out. Most of this is going to be in the 80s. It just makes me feel old, really. Like I say, an awful lot of stuff then that was brands that may or may, some have disappeared, some have carried on but evolved and changed into other things. There's one that I've found out that I thought had died years ago is actually still out there, and I'll talk about them later. But yeah, where do we start? Probably with the NAD 3020. I mean, that was one of those products that it shouldn't have been as good as it was. It was very capable of driving speakers. You could argue it was quite coloured, and I think the coloration in it, people sort of latched onto that because it gave a bit of a hump in the sort of lower mid and bass. And you could make quite a basic little setup sound really good. It had a punch to it that was really sort of quite engaging sort of sound. So most people started out with a dual turntable or a Pioneer PL12 sometimes. Dual turntable, an NAD, and either KEF coders, AR18s. There's various Mordant Short, Pageants or whatever. There was a whole group of people who that's what the first system would have been, really. And the 3028 continued for a good while. I mean, and then it started to evolve, and as they evolved it, they kind of killed that sort of magic, I think, really. The later versions were never as good as the original 3020A. And the very original had the little power meter on it. I actually went out to buy one when I was, don't know how old I would have been, in the late 70s, when it was quite a new product, actually. And I'd read about it in the magazines, I wasn't working in the industry then. And was persuaded out of it by a guy in a hi-fi shop because I wanted to buy a dual, funnily enough, a NAD and a pair of AR18s. My friend had AR18s and I'd read about the other two bits. He said, "Oh no, you don't want that. You don't want that." So I ended up buying Hitachi HT50S turntable. I think it was direct drive quartz locked or something. I can't remember now. With an Audio Technica 110 on it. Crikey. And a Hitachi HA3700 amplifier, but the amplifier was actually okay, and I did keep that, but the turntable switched quite quickly to a dual, which I should have bought in the first place. And the Hitachi I continued using until I bought an AIM amp. So I've never actually owned an AD, and I sometimes feel as though it'd be quite good to just make up a little retro system and have a 3020 in it, just so I can experience that in my life, because I never actually owned one. Loved it, but never owned one. Just after the NAD, there was an amplifier called the Creek 4040, which was more audiophile in its sort of aims, really. It was very clean and clear and neutral. It did have a few quirks with it. It was unusual at that time because people were sort of moving away from features. The 60s, 70s amplifiers had subsonic filters and tone controls. You'd have bass, mid and treble on some things. Sometimes little graphics and all this sort of thing that messed around with the tone and messed around with the sound quality and all this sort of. And so people were moving away from that. But the Creek had bass and treble on it, And I think it had subsonic filter. It had some sort of filter on it. I can't remember. I think it was like a rumble filter or something on there. So it was sort of almost bridging the gap. It was trying to be in two camps at once, really. But it was a lovely, lovely sounding amp. It's very, very clear and pacey sounding. Needed quite a good source on it to get the best out of it. But it was great. It was really, and it drove well. I mean, a little Creek with a pair of Kefs or the A18s was lovely. It was really HB1s. I seem to remember working well with the Creek. Later on, they sort of backtracked and they brought out the 4140, which was kind of the same amp, but with no tone controls, no filters on it or whatever. It was just straight through. And to be fair, it was better, but it wasn't actually a lot better, really. I think the 4040 is still the one I remember as being sort of shocked by, really, as to how good it was. They were the ones in the magazines. The Nad and the Creek were very much to the fore in the magazines. There was a model, well, a brand that were known in the magazines but weren't known for amplifiers, and I think they were probably the best of all, and that was QED. I mean, QED in the early 80s were making, well, they introduced QED 79 speakers cable, 79 strand speakers. I forgot how to speak. Let me just have a drink. They I've lost it totally now. They brought out, sorry, oh dear. They brought out QED 79 speaker cable, and they were one of the first to actually suggest that putting a better cable on the system was a thing, really. And they probably made quite a bit of money on that because they had the market to themselves, and we were selling it with every system. Every system had a QED 79 strand with it. Usually we'd just give a 10-metre run with the system. So, ambulance, yeah. So I could imagine we used to buy 200 or 300-metre drums of it at a time. It was just loads and loads of it. And they were also producing these little folded metal switch boxes, like speaker switching and input expansion boxes. So if you didn't have enough inputs, you could put it into this expansion box, and 1 in, 3 out, and all that sort of thing. And that's what they were doing. That's what they were known for, was accessories. But they brought out a little amplifier called the A230. A230S, actually, thinking about it. Little MIDI-sized, slim box, very, very purist, just volume control, balance, selector switch. And it was really good. It was such a good amplifier. And then they brought another model out, which was a 240, which had a bit more power, and it had a modular front end on it, so you could put there was A240 CD, which was line level only, and then you could put a module in, which was phono stage, which was the SA board, which was I think a switchable magnet coil, possibly. I can't remember actually what that was, but it was a very good phono stage. So you had the 230, the 240, and the 240 SA, and they were great. They were it was almost like a precursor to going up to name. They had that clarity and definition, but they were cheaper than name and sort of like I say, a bit of a step down. So we sold loads of them, absolutely loads of them. I remember ordering, normally with things like amplifiers, you probably have a couple in stock, just in case. I remember with the QEDs having 10, 15 on the shelf, because every Saturday there'd be a system with a QED in it that would going out really, just put it on. It was like, wow, I'll have to have one of those. I've never heard of it, but I'll have to have one. They never really got picked up by the magazines. I don't know. I think QED in later life became much better at sort of marketing themselves, and obviously they're massive nowadays. They unfortunately don't really do anything like that now. After the 230, 240, they did do a slightly bigger. There was a pre-power called the P300, C300, which was okay. I never thought that had the magic of the small stuff. But after that, once they'd finished those, they didn't do it anymore. They moved on to doing multi-room. It's one of the very first multi-room systems. Sort of went off in a different direction, really. It was Bob Abrahams, I think, at QED, and he showed me the blueprints for System Line, which it became. And I thought he was mad, to be honest. I went down to the factory, he was showing me this thing. I thought, I can't imagine, why would people want to have music piped to every room? Surely the quality is going to be awful. But actually, no, he was right. He did, and it took off, and it's still big. The newer versions of System Line now are still really popular. Anyway, let's get back to amplifiers. Where are we? I actually made notes because, as you know, my memory is awful. slightly higher up the range, the Audiolab 8008. Now that, I wanted to talk about things which made an impression. The thing about the 8000A was, it had fantastic reviews. It was on the cover of every magazine. It was, you know, and it had. I was quite excited when it came out. After reading reviews of it, I thought this is going to be great. We're going to, you know, they're going to clean up with these because it's got everything you could ever need on it. Little drive, everything, you know, drives really well. The magazine says it's the best amplifier under whatever price it was, which was probably 3 times what it cost. I remember hearing it the first time. I was massively disappointed with it. It was a bit odd because it had the ability to sound bright and dull at the same time. It was bizarre. It was very rolled off at the top end, but aggressive as well. It seemed to manage to do 2 things at the same time. And all my colleagues hated it. I spoke to other dealers who were doing it as well. They all hated it. But we were sort of inundated by people wanting them. So we look into the den room, see what you think of it. And people were still buying it, even though, and it was like, really, you're sure? Because we don't like this. Oh, well, it's a 5-star review. Oh. So it was a bit of a, yeah. That was the very, very early. I mean, they quite quickly developed it, and it started to really become a serious contender. The very, very first one, which I was entirely din socketry on the back. That was the one that didn't really perform, I didn't think. But when they started to develop it a bit later on, it got a lot better. And there was a version of it called there was a model up from it called the 8000S, which was really good, actually. It was a really good amp. Their pre-powers were, well, they did pre-powers. The power amps were superb. The preamps were a little bit iffy, apart from, because I think the 8000C was roughly based on the 8000A, and I think the preamp section of the 8000A was a bit that let it down, really. But they did do later a preamp called the 8000Q, and that was amazing. Again, that was a really good preamp. Just at the point where they were really flying Audiolab, and the whole range was good and everything was sorted, Phil Swift sold out to Tag McLaren, which was a massive shock, actually. All of a sudden it was, no, I'm walking away from it, and here's the new owners, and it's not going to be called Audiolab anymore, it's going to be called Tag McLaren. And Tag McLaren, that was a bit of an oddity, really. They basically used all the blueprints of the Audiolab equipment, put more expensive componentry in, made the fascias a bit fancier, put the Tag McLaren name on it, and almost doubled the price. And I remember them sort of a conversation about it, saying, well, it's got our badge on it, so it's a desirable product because it's got our badge on it. And it didn't work at all, because they were almost trying to sell it as a sort of aspirational, you know, branding sort of thing, like a bit of jewellery. And the hi-fi industry doesn't work like that. People aren't sort of don't generally. I think they do more now, but at the time people weren't buying hi-fi in that way, really. Not like you buy a watch or a car or something else. It was purely on performance, and the performance wasn't really any better. And some of the models were worse. Even though they spent quite a bit and brought the quality of the componentry up, it almost unbalanced the character of the amplifier, and they didn't quite gel anymore. Some of them, not all of them, but some of the models weren't as good. Anyway, let's go away from that one. Where are we now? Oh, I tell you what, it's actually, yeah, something that was pretty good in the very early days was early days of Musical Fidelity. I mean, Anthony Michelson had produced an amplifier called, well, it's Michelson Audio. There's a big valve amp that he did, big integrated valve amp, which is astonishingly good when it works, but it was horrendously unreliable. And I'll get the phone. Yeah, back to you in a second. Right, I'm back. Where were we? Anthony Michelson Audio, yeah. The big valve amp, superb thing, a really superb thing. Ridiculously heavy. It was barely could lift it yourself, and it was good, but they always failed. I mean, I think almost 100% failure rate with them, from what I can remember. But after that, Musical Fidelity was born as a separate sort of entity, and I think the first product was a pre-power. The preamp was called the preamp, which isn't totally imaginative, but it's, yeah, little tiny preamp, and a power amp called the Dr. Thomas, which was almost like a sort of cube shape with did it have a Perspex front? I think it did, with Dr. Thomas written across it in red. That was wonderful. That was a really good amp, that, actually. I mean, that wasn't particularly reliable either. I think the preamp was okay, but the power amps could could be a bit problematic, but generally they were really good. From mixed fidelity, probably the biggie was the A1. I mean, that was again audiophile type sound quality out of something which was, you know, medium range price. Little Class A amp, not very powerful particularly, but it drove okay. You know, if you've kept it in systems that it could handle, that was a really good amp. Again, massively unreliable. And then he did an A100. I mean, the A1 struggled because it got hot, because it was Class A, and it didn't really have enough ways to dissipate the heat. So the obvious thing to do is to make a much more powerful version. And as predicted by everybody who heard about it, it was more unreliable than the A1. But that was a really good amp as well. There's not much else from MF that I would say really stood out, but those two particular, I think the B200s were okay. But it wasn't top of the tree at its price range particularly, but it was a good alternative. Going back another step, Nitec were always very good. I've talked about Nitec on here before, and I loved the 252. Very nearly bought one. Actually, when I had the Hitachi, I went for a demonstration of A&R 60, Nitec 252, and the name Nate, and bought the Nate because I think the Nate had literally just come through the door, one of the very first ones off the truck, so to speak. So I bought the name Nate, but actually, in some ways, I sort of regret in some ways that I never actually owned. Well, I did own one later life. I bought a second-hand one and used it for a bit and quite enjoyed it. But they, again, not very reliable. A lot of the stuff that was very good tended to be a little bit quirky, really. But you wouldn't get away with it now, particularly, I don't think. But yeah, Nitec, I've said this before on here. When I was at Brady's in Liverpool, we had a separate set of shelves that was just for Nitec repairs. And I don't think they ever had the same fault twice. It was one of those situations. Right, I'm back. Somebody in the shop, actually. It's part of the problem. It's not really a problem having people in the shop at all. It's a good thing. But from a point of view of getting videos done, Tuesday, Wednesday, you can forget it because it's so busy in the shop. And the phone's ringing, people are coming in, deliveries. You're getting stuff ready to go out, having to go up to the depot with EPD and stuff like that. So yeah, Friday seems to be the day, sometimes Thursdays. But if it's busy on a Friday, then I've lost the week. So that's a bit, yeah. Hopefully it'll get better in that respect. I mean, like I said, it's good to be busy, but I like to keep a balance of things. Really like doing the videos. Nitec, yeah, like I say, we used to have an actual area of shelving just for the repairs. But people stuck by them actually because they were good amps. And okay, you got the occasional quirk with them, but yeah, like I say, different times. Like I say, just people wouldn't put up with it now. They wouldn't put up with any sort of failure from anything. Where are we going after this? I mean, it's interesting actually. I've nowadays lost a bit of interest in high end because I think an awful lot of it is a bit jewellery-like. There is an element of making stuff look really fancy and putting a big price tag on it and everything, and probably it sounds okay, but it's not worth the money quite often, really. I mean, the price of high-end has gone crazy, absolutely crazy. 30, 40, 50,000 pound power amps, things like that, which, like I say, I'm sure they're very good, but I just can't see how you would... Anyway, but going back, Krell. I mean, I used to love the Krell amps, really. Preamps, not so much. I think the preamps, there was better things out there, which I'll talk about in a sec. But the best of all was the Krell 80, the big power amp with the big fins on it. The really, you know, the one that you could cut your wrists by carrying it in the wrong way. And the big grab handles front and back. That was a fabulous thing. It's probably one of the cleanest amplifiers I've ever heard, that really. I remember there was a 50 and a 100 and a 200, and I never really quite got on with them to the same degree. They always sounded a little bit overblown somehow. But Krell 80 was just some of the best systems I've ever heard had Krell 80s in. Tended to partner it with Audio Research, and because they were particularly good at preamps, but I never quite got on with the power amps. And the power amps were quite unreliable. Well, at the time, were quite unreliable. SP8, SP9, or later they did an LS1, which was a preamp, but it didn't have a phono stage in it. The SP8 had a fairly decent, and it had a fairly decent phono stage in it. And the SP11, SP15 was sort of the high end of it. I think they did a guy with an SP15 and a Crow 80, and it was just incredibly good. And I think that was with what I mentioned it in the previous video. Actually, I think that system was with Sonus Faber Electors, and it just seemed to gel. That system was probably the purest, cleanest, most musical sounding system ever. With a Sondek, I think it was. I think it was Sondek. It was something slightly obscure, like a Sondek with a Zeta arm and a Koetsu red signature on it, something like that. It was a very specific system, but it just seemed to gel. There's quite a few people who were good at preamps, actually, in this sort of, like I say, in these smaller companies. I mean, there's a Pink Triangle Pip is probably one of the best preamps ever made. Very rare thing. I mean, I don't think many people really knew it even existed, but the Pip was really clean and clear and really lovely sounding preamp. Another manufacturer, actually, I don't know what's happened to him, actually. I don't know whether he's still out there, but Dennis Moorcroft, D&M stuff. I mean, again, you probably wouldn't get away with it nowadays, but look, their stuff was in little plastic boxes with controls on that looked like they were straight out of the RS catalogue, which they probably were, actually, but they were very roughly built sort of products. Internally they were good, but the external, it was like that was an afterthought, which, well, plastic box, a couple of knobs on it, that'll do. But they were amazing preamps. They were not cheap. They were an expensive product. But yeah, they were absolutely superb. And I can't remember particularly liking the power amp that he did. I think he did do a little power amp, but which was okay. But the preamps were the main thing. D&M preamps. I also was trying to think around that time. Oh, actually, I actually had at one point a preamp by a company called Rose, and I don't think it's the same Rose that are around now. Henley Audio do a brand called Rose. They're quite high tech. Now, the Rose preamp I had was a pure valve pre, a little tiny thing, and I had that with a Dawson DC35 valve power amp. And that was really good. I mean, it was just such a good preamp. I think, funny enough, I ended up switching it for a name, weirdly. I think a 72 and a high cap into the Dawson, which was kind of better. But the main reason I switched it was that the Rose kept doing weird things. It'd be okay for a while, and then it would start to whistle in time to the music. Noise going on, which wasn't good particularly. So I sort of ended up ditching that. But that was lovely. While it was working, that was really nice. I mean, I do like a valve preamp, but there's not that many out there that really either sound good or are reliable or are affordable. You know, you never seem to get all those three elements in one box somehow. I mean, I know there's things like Icon. There's various companies out there doing it now, but at the time, certainly at the time, it was either you paid a load of money or they were unreliable. Or sometimes, well, not saying that, all your research stuff wasn't necessarily that reliable, and it was expensive. So even spending money on it didn't necessarily give you pure, total happiness. I'm trying to think. I've got my little list there. Yeah, I'm kind of getting towards the end of this now. Of sort of things that came to mind earlier on. Another one was really good. I mean, this is pre-power, but Crimson Electric. Now, again, not many people have heard of Crimson. They're quite local. They're over there, in fact. They're about 10, 15 miles over there, or they certainly were. Where they are now, I don't know. Because this is the other thing with Crimson. They were very much a 1980s manufacturer. They did a pre-power called 520, 530, which was a little tiny, small fronted amplifier, about that sort of front panel, and the power amps were the same. But they were very deep front to back, so long, almost like a long tube design. And they would absolutely, I hate the phrase again, but giant killers. That little pre-power was as good as some of the mid-range name stuff, but a third of the price. And they were just incredibly good sounding amps. he didn't really market himself very well. He didn't. I don't think many people knew of the existence, and I think it might have just been a single guy running it. I don't think it was it wasn't a big manufacturer. It was just a single guy. So probably his capabilities of knocking him out wouldn't be that great. I'm not sure whether the 500 had this, but certainly there was a 620, 630 as well, and one of the models, I can't remember which now, was a battery preamp. And that worked really well. I mean, it was a great. It was, I think, it just reminded me. I think the pit preamp that I mentioned way back. I think the pit preamp was a battery, or there was a battery modification for it anyway. But yeah, Crimson. But I actually did a little bit of research the other day because I thought, I wonder if he does exist, because people kept saying to me, "Oh yeah, he's still around. He just makes stuff for his friends now. He doesn't really sell to dealers." But I checked up on it, and he does. You can buy Crimson, but they're not the ultra high value products they were. They look very similar. The preamp's very high tech now, but the power amps look the same as they did back then. But they're thousands, absolutely thousands. So I'm assuming things have been improved quite a bit. But I think I saw $7,000 for the power amps, whereas, like I say, they were sort of undercutting name by quite a margin years ago. So either it's completely different or he's repositioned himself. Certainly worth a lot of money. I mean, I could see people justifying it because they were superb little amps. Looking at my list again. Yeah, power amps. I was trying to, because I went through all the preamps, I was trying to think of what power amps were particularly good. Krell 80 mentioned that. One that was quite surprising, and if I found it by accident, I used to do quite a lot of Rotel. And Rotel brought out a pre-power. I remember listening to it and thinking, oh, it's a bit bland. But the power was quite interesting because you could switch it to mono. So you could bridge it internally, and it would use both channels together and create a single output out of it. So you could have monoblocks. And I thought that's quite interesting. So I remember hooking up the power amps to a different preamp just to try it in something a bit higher end. And they sounded amazing. Way beyond the price that they were, and came to the conclusion that it was all the preamp was the problem. Was all the preamp, and I actually ended up with one of the better hi-fi systems I've ever owned, actually, and it wasn't anything particularly expensive. My old AR18s from years and years ago, which I modified them and made them bi-wireable so you could buy amp, seal them up properly and brace them, and I did all sorts of mad stuff to them. Kimber cable they had at the time. And I had 4 Rotel 850 monoblocks and a name pre-power. I think I went to the monoblocks after the big Dawson. So I think it was either 72 high cap and the Rotels, or it might have been 32 high cap. And at the time I had a pink triangle with a Autophon Quasar, Quattro, or Quartz, whichever was the most expensive of those. It was the modern, at the time it was the modern equivalent of an MC30, and I loved it, and it really suited the pink triangle. The pink had a Tabriz arm on it, I think. You know, I can't remember. I think it was a Tabriz ZI with an Autophon moving coil into the name, and then into these, and it was phenomenally good. I mean, the power was ridiculous. I think somebody worked out with it. It said if you bridge it and do this, then you multiply that by 2, and it was something like an equivalent of 600 watts a channel, which I know that doesn't matter, but because of the extra current and the 4 transformers and all this sort of thing, the grip it had on the speakers was just ridiculous. So they were producing bass then they just shouldn't have been able to do because they were being gripped so well. I never understood why I moved away onto other stuff after that, really. But you sort of tire of things, don't you, and swap it and then regret it afterwards. I've kind of wondered about trying to get back into the 4 monoblock thing again, because I think that was part of it. I think it was the biamping plus everything separated out, so every driver on the speakers had its own power amp, and it just worked so well. But yeah, that was a long time ago. Would have been end of the 80s probably when I had that set up. Yeah, I missed the pink triangle as well, actually. Where are we going now? Oh yeah, the other one that was quite, going back to NAD again. NAD did a series called Monitor Series, and it was sort of a high-end, well, sort of high-end NAD, but it was kind of mid to high-end prices, really. It wasn't ultra high-end. And they did a great cassette deck. Monetary Series cassette decks are very, I think it's 6100 cassette deck, which was as good as an Akamishi at the time, but nothing like the price. I remember having one of the reps from NAD bringing round, now I'm struggling to remember which model number it was. It might have been the 2600 PE power amp. I know it was big and it was really heavy, and NAD had this sort of clever power envelope thing where they could produce power very, very quickly. It sort of almost had like a reserve for short bursts of power. And I think it was something like 500 watt peak or something like that. It was something crazy. I remember wiring it up with one of my colleagues, listening to this with the rep in the room. I mean, it was wired into a Hebrook HB1s, I think it was, with something like an SP8 Audio Research or something like a preamp. And playing, if you've ever heard it, there was a test album, which is probably the most boring album ever made, but it's a Sheffield drum record, and it was just, I think it was Jim Keltner playing drums. And it was just him basically sort of doing little jam sessions and doing little, ups and downs and all this sort of thing. And then there's a bit where he completely goes for it. And we were turning it up and turning it up. Well, I wasn't doing it. It wasn't me. Turning it up and turning it up. And I remember at one point there was like a big crescendo of bass. It's like at the end. And on the last both bass units pushed out and stayed out, and a little whiff of smoke out of the drivers. Completely fried the drivers. But my word, it was like a live. I think the problem was it sounded live and it sounded clean and it sounded like it wasn't even trying. But unfortunately, the speakers didn't think the same, and they completely gave out without any warning. They were holding together beautifully until they died. So I think that's the only time I've been involved in actually blowing a pair of speakers up, to be honest. I did have a pair of speakers fall off the stand once. That was my R18s actually. I had them on stands that weren't quite attached. They were sitting on. I think I was experimenting with stands, and that was James Taylor Fire and Rain. The big drum roll in that, and that sort of boom. Yeah, that was not quite blowing them up, but yeah, similar. I'm quite good actually. I don't tend to play massively loud really. I've never really blown anything up apart from that occasion. It wasn't me anyway. It was somebody else. Yeah, nearly done now actually. I think that's about it. The only other two I was thinking of earlier was there was a company called Albury as well that did some great stuff, and I think a lot of the thing with Albury was they looked great. They had they did a grey fronted one as well, but they were pre-power. They sat next to each other, and they had like a Perspex front, and one of them was like a red, one option was like a red front on there, and they looked wonderful, and they sounded a bit like valve amps. They had a lovely big open natural sort of presentation, but they didn't last long as a company really. They sort of disappeared and tried to make a comeback, or somebody either bought the name or somebody, I can't remember the situation with that, but about 10 years ago they tried to make a bit of a comeback and reintroduce them, and then it disappeared again. Whether or not, I'd have to look into that and see what happened really, but they seemed to disappear again. But they were good, yeah. They're quite fondly remembered by a lot of people actually, people who sort of were around at the time. Last one, and this is quite a rarity, and I kind of wished I'd bought this at the time. When I was I think I was briefly at Warrington Brady's, and there was an amplifier called Lentec there, which had been a trade-in, and it had been sat around for ages, and nobody wanted it. And the reason they didn't want it was a big integrated, about this tall and about this wide. It weighed an absolute ton. It was this ridiculous big amplifier that nobody had heard of, and it was quite expensive. I think at the time it was sort of £1,000, £1,500 amplifier, which was a lot then. At the time it was a lot of money for an amp, and the fashion at the time was to buy pre-power. It was like everything separated out. If your amplifier doesn't consist of 7 boxes, it can't be any good. And here's this single box, expensive amplifier, and it was just sat on the shelf gathering dust. Nobody wanted it. I had they dropped me cover. I remember listening to it thinking, it's amazing, this thing. It had tremendous control, and it was very, very natural. And I think it was the only product they ever made, apart from there was a little phono stage they made as well, which was kind of ahead of its time, because you didn't really have phono stages then. They were integral to the amp, or it was an optional card. You didn't tend to have them separate. I think the only one around that time that was a separate phono stage was the made by Tom Evans, the Michel ISO phono stage, little plastic box. I can't think of any others, if I'm honest. I can't think of anybody else who was actually doing separate phono stages. But no, the Lentec, I think that was fantastic memories of that. That was such a good amp, and I should have taken it home. Really, I don't know why I didn't. But they didn't make very many. I believe I did a little Google on this when I was thinking about it. I think they only made 500, which is nothing really in sort of worldwide terms, anyway. Anyway, what happened to them, I don't know. They just seemed to vanish, really. But it's probably because it wasn't a pre-power. If they'd done a pre-power, I can't see why it wouldn't have succeeded, because it was a superb sounding amp. Anyway, I'll leave it there. I've got to the end of my list. If I think of any more, I might do a part 2. But I've been lucky so far that there's not been that many interruptions, really. But yeah, I hope you like this one. I've got I want to do a review of those acoustic energies. I seem to be losing the power of speech at the moment. I think it's the workload. My brain isn't totally locking on somehow. Sort of lack of sleep and overwork is getting to me. Doing a lot of late installs and stuff at houses as well. Yeah, I'm going to do the review of those, and I will do a cartridge cosy chat. And I want to do some stuff in the workshop as well, but I've just not had anything appropriate. Just, you know, some little fixes and things like that, really. I've got an Ariston downstairs at the moment, actually, which I might do a bit of videoing on, but we'll see. I'll see. They're a bit fiddly to work on those, so whether I'll use that or not, I don't know. Anyway, thanks for watching. Don't forget to give a subscribe and a like. I will see you in a future video. Hopefully I won't leave it too long. Try and get one in recorded next Thursday, Friday, if we're quiet enough. I'll see you soon. Thank you very much.